Python is too slow. I heard this so many times while building my text editor, and there's a lot of truth to this. Python's pretty slow. But I wanted to walk you through how that speed can be perceived in different places and where it sometimes doesn't matter. But also how I took steps to resolve those speed problems in my text editor. For those of you that don't know, when I type nano on my terminal in my videos, I'm actually running a text editor that I wrote myself called babi. Babi is a typo of nano if you shifted your hand over by one. Of course, it doesn't work on a split keyboard, but you'll just have to imagine. Anyway, in order to talk about this, I want to talk about some of the things in Python that are particularly slow and how that impacts or doesn't impact a text editor. The first, and probably the one that people run into probably the most, is the startup time of Python. Now, on its own, Python doesn't actually take that long to do nothing. You can see here, I mean, even 21 milliseconds is still quite a lot. Of course, if you do no site mode, you can get it down to 8-ish milliseconds. But sometimes when you have to import an entire set of modules and all of its dependencies, dang it. What do you mean I don't have identify installed? Okay. What? Well, that's really weird. Are my modules just broken? What? What is going on here? Maybe it's on just such an old version? No module named identify. Hold on a second. It's definitely there. What? Oh, because I have capital S. No site mode, so you get no dependency. Anyway, what I want to show is, you're importing an entire application, you import all those dependencies, that's going to add up to some additional time here. And so startup time of an application is pretty important. For a text editor, I don't know that it's that important. You don't really notice how long it takes to open up a file. It's just kind of there. Yes, if you think about it and internalize it, yeah, there's a small pause from when I press enter and this appears and it's rendered and highlighted. But for the most part, startup time isn't that important. Python's pretty slow. Startup time in Python pretty bad, but not that big of a deal. The other part of Python that's slow is general CPU computation in general. Yes, you're going to get much more performance out of a compiled language such as C++ or Go or Rust or Swift even to some extent, where you can run instructions natively on processor instead of running through a virtual machine of bytecode, is how Python or CPython executes. Of course, if you have a just-in-time compiler such as something like PyPy, you can get closer to native speeds, but we're just going to talk about CPython. And so generally, any amount of computation that you're going to do is going to be pretty slow. And when thinking about a text editor, you actually have to do quite a bit of computation to make something like this show up. Honestly, most of the computation is around syntax highlighting, and that's the part of babi that was the most difficult for me. How do you make syntax highlighting appear relatively instantly while not complicating your entire setup? And I aimed, when designing babi, I didn't actually think I was going to ever finish this project, so it wasn't really designed from the beginning. It was just kind of, I wanted the simplest thing that I could make work. And so, believe it or not, babi re-renders this entire screen every single key press. And I mean, you don't really notice the lag because it's actually, Python's fast enough to make this happen, believe it or not. I'll actually show you some of the tools that I used to get this optimized to this point, because there were definitely parts that were not optimized, and at points it was noticeably laggy. And I'll show you some of the things that are the worst things that you can do in Babi, because I optimized for a simple architecture that made it easy to write the code to make this possible, while not trying to hyper over optimize for making everything async, or making things lazily evaluated and make syntax highlighting pop in and out. No, it just renders the whole thing every single key press. Focusing on a simplistic architecture allowed me to actually complete this project. I say complete this project. I'm still, I still add features to it occasionally. It's been a while. This module doesn't exist anymore. Well, it does, but it's deprecated. There's no. Anyway, that's a whole different thing. But I managed to get this functional, and it's the text editor that I use for everything. I use it for work. I use it for streams. I use it for YouTube videos. It's my baby. Oh, silly pun. But I needed to focus on making that loop, that render loop, be fast. So you don't notice that when you're pressing keys that it actually has some amount of delay to re-render the whole screen. There are actually things in Babi that are particularly bad, but you don't run into them usually during normal execution. One of them, for instance, is if you open a file and it's a very, very long file, and you go to exactly the end of the file. It's kind of hard to notice there, but there was a noticeable pause there. And I'll actually show you later how we can measure that noticeable pause, because even though I notice it, it's probably not that impactful. Probably like a few hundred milliseconds, probably not even a few hundred milliseconds, probably some tens of milliseconds, but you can kind of notice it. It's within the realm that a human is going to notice while they're interacting with the program. I probably don't care though, and so maybe that's good enough. Another thing that Babi does sort of poorly at is highlighting very, very long lines. And it actually uses the same syntax highlighter or syntax language that VS Code uses, and I just didn't do the optimization that VS Code does. Basically what VS Code does is if a line takes too long to highlight, it just gives up and just stops highlighting that line. So the easiest way to show this is with an old theme that was triggered through Twitch chat. Yeah, so you could definitely notice the pause there, and that's because it highlighted this entire 36,000 character line all at once and all eagerly, because Babi just highlights line by line. If this were not all one line, and if it were split up by a number of lines, it wouldn't have had the same pause, because it highlights one line at a time. So those are the things that are bad. Now I wanted to show you how I actually worked on optimizing this, because even though Python is slow, you can still take some steps to make the slower parts faster, and you can still have inefficiencies, and you want to be able to measure those and then improve on them. And so I actually built in a profiler to the editor itself. babi-help, there's this little perf log, which gives you both a high-level representation of what's going on, but it also gives you a cProfile log. Now it has to specially instrument this, because if you just ran the cProfiler against the whole program, anytime it's pausing for input, the profiler is going to think those are big, expensive functions, even though it's waiting for a human to type at the keyboard, which isn't that your program's slow, it's just that's how the program works. So that's why I needed to make a special thing for this. But if I do babi perf log, I don't even remember how this works. Hopefully this is how it works. We'll see. And yes, I'm editing itself with itself. Very meta. But this particular file is helpful because it's kind of big. And basically what it does, every time there's a key press, that perf log will get a little bit of information here. So we'll just press some arrow keys for a little bit, maybe type some stuff, move some stuff, and then do the thing that takes forever, which is going to the very end of the file. And if we exit out of this and we look at our log, you'll see that it records the amount of microseconds for each event that occurred. You can see here that startup is particularly expensive. This is both because Babi needs to load all the themes and do the initial highlight of the file, but also just Python startup is kind of slow. Import modules make all that other stuff happen, and so this 30,000 microseconds, 30 milliseconds is significant. Of course, a human can perceive 30 milliseconds, but for the most part, you're not really going to notice that as a noticeable lag. And for the rest of this, pressing keys, a single event is taking 400 microseconds. That's not perceivable by humans for the most part. Hopefully not, unless you're superhuman. But what's happening in that 300, 400 microseconds there is a full render of the screen. I did no optimization on screen rendering. Most of my optimizations were on making the syntax highlighter faster. And so there's still opportunities to make this even faster, but I would argue that it doesn't matter. A single event taking 400 microseconds, who cares? That's, obviously I could min-max this down to some smaller number, or, if this were written in Go or Rust or whatever, maybe it's 30 microseconds, but who cares? It literally does not matter, because this is not a perceivable amount of lag here. And even on a machine with significantly worse processing power, maybe this is 600 microseconds or even a millisecond. You're not going to notice that having keys. Now, I will actually show you a way that you can notice this. I can show this in a sec if I copy a bunch of text. We'll show that later. And you can see here, like, yes, when I pressed keys here, so this is, oh wait, why this one? Oh, I must have scrolled down. This must have been a scroll event, so it triggered more highlighting here. But you'll see here when I enter strings, it has to do some rehighlighting, and so, oh no, it took 2.5 milliseconds there. But again, 2.5 milliseconds is fast enough. You're not going to notice that. Even if you're typing really, really fast, you'd have to have, what, 40 characters per second for that to have like some amount of noticeable lag there. And so you're just never going to notice this. It's fast enough. And this is the particular, the worst case scenario. This is where I jumped to the end of the file. And even then, yeah, it's 287 milliseconds. That's still, like, that's definitely noticeable, but it's not the end of the world. You can wait 200 milliseconds. It's not going to kill you there. Anyway, the other half of this I want to show you is the cProfile, which gets automatically generated here. If I cProfile dot, I've shown this tool off previously. Oh, because I can't spell. gprof2 dot log.pstats dot tsv. I think this is the way this works. I don't know. We'll see. Yeah, we get a cProfile output here. And so you can kind of see that most of the time is spent in highlighting. I spent a lot of time staring at this and optimizing various parts, but yeah. And most of the time in the highlighting is actually running the regular expression engine that does the actual highlighting, which is this thing over here. Anyway, this has been really helpful for me to figure out what parts are slow. And sometimes I was surprised by the things that were slow. I'll give you one example. I'm going to just make up an example because it's not the actual code here. But at some point in here, inside of a function, I had another function which had, and this was old typing, so it was something like this. I don't know, list stir. And surprisingly, well, this was before future annotations and string annotations. Surprisingly, this type annotation was taking like 90% of the event loop at babi. And you would have never guessed that without a profile. The reason for this is the generic lookup here does some additional computation to make sure this is a real class. And so this annotation can have a significant runtime overhead. Of course, the way that I fixed it back then was to quote the annotation so that it doesn't get evaluated. Of course, after Python 3.7, you can just put from future annotations or from future import annotations, and also don't get evaluated. But this was something that completely surprised me, and I would have never figured out without a profiler. Which I guess is another rule. Like, If it's slow, use a profiler to figure out what's wrong rather than guessing at what's slow and hacking around the problem until you get to the point where you figured out what is or isn't slow. What was this tangent that I was on? I don't know. Anyway, use a profiler. Yes, Python is slow, but if it's not important to be fast, who cares? And I also just wanted to show off my text editor. Something. Oh, off topic. I frequently do this thing where first parent. I frequently do this thing where I copy and paste. Oh, this is. Let's get some larger diff. Auto update. This is entirely off topic. One line? These are all... Find a longer one. This one surely had a bigger patch. I found this cool trick in Babi where I frequently like copy paste code out of a diff into a file. So if I open up, I don't know, t.py, and I paste this. And what I used to do is do a find replace for a beginning of line and then escaped plus and replace it with nothing. And that works. Do all that. Oops, then I need to undo. But I found a cheekier way to do this, which is Babi has a command mode, and there's a comment command, which normally just puts the comment character, but you can customize the comment character, and so you can use plus as your comment character, which has the same operation. Anyway, cheeky little thing. Even I am learning things about my own text editor after using it for years. The summary of this is I rambled a lot, but yes, Python is slow. It's particularly slow at startup. It's also slow at CPU bound operations, but a lot of times it doesn't matter, and that's okay. Sometimes it's okay to be slow. Hopefully you found this useful. If there are additional things you'd like me to explain, leave a comment below or reach out to me on the various platforms, but thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next one.